Welcome back to the Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno 1989 to 1996. Today I'll be continuing my voyage into 1993's expansive range of releases, starting with Big Rooms by Deep Space Network. Following the release of their self-titled Earth to Infinity in 1992, Jonas Grossman and David Mufang regrouped, renamed and went about creating a much deeper album. Most of the elements from Earth to Infinity are present: heavy use of samples, meshing of electronics and live instrumentation, a strong jazz influence and hints of dance music, but the whole project feels elevated. Their tracks are slightly shorter and more tightly constructed, showing more focus. Opener Zen La starts in classic ambient house mode with tropical field recordings and spoken samples, and meanders through down-tempo house programming and gently jazzy breakbeats, with warm synth pads and slightly off-kilter soloing providing direction. It's atmospheric, chilled, yet strange enough to warrant deeper listening. With its faster tempo and three squelches, the Beyond Within is just about danceable, although samples and mellow organ chords keep it from breaking the laid-back vibe. Something these tracks never do is stand still, moving from one segment to the next in a bout of restless creativity. Starts with ambient eastern mysticism and ends with gentle bleak techno. Drones behind doors of perception shuffling jazz drums veer from euphoric to forebodingly bleak. Psychopath is alternately breakbeat and melody forward. Nothing Is starts mellow and ends almost comical. As with The Orb, Grossman and Mufang upped their production game from their second album, moving away from the scrappy cut and paste production of their debut into something smoother, more synthetic, more polished and just overall far more sonically impressive. An album of continual surprises and creativity, it's rightly considered one of the landmark ambient house records. A year after its initial release on the band's own Source imprint, Big Rooms was licensed for release in the US as one of 7 albums released for Instinct Records' ambient sub-label's inaugural year, albeit with significantly inferior artwork, including Instinct's house style for using the inner booklet to advertise other releases on the label, which has always struck me as incredibly cynical. Later, a double LP version became the debut release on Rediscovery Records, Tim Humphrey's remarkable label focused on reissuing classic and forgotten albums from the era. Air Liquide's debut album, the self-titled, was their first release with different track lists over different formats. This would become a recurring theme throughout the band's confusing discography. With several vinyl exclusive and CD exclusive tracks, as well as overlap with EPs, including the previously covered Neue Frankfurter Elektronikschule, it's not easy to get a comprehensive version of their debut album. Stylistically, it continues the band's blend of chilly ambience and techno, with fairly sinister beatless tracks like Things Happen, Argon, as well as atmospheric stripped back acid on Liquid Air and Revelation. The slower tempo and flute samples of Unravelling My Curls throw it straight into ambient house territory, feeling not so far away from the likes of Deep Space Network or some of Namlook's more rhythmic material. Best of all is Liquid Men with Liquid Hearts, a slice of uplifting space techno in a similar vein to Aphex Twin's Polynomial C. The band's remix of Mike Inck's Gelb is a short, abstract experiment and a baffling choice to end the CD version, but you can't have everything. On the subject of slightly odd dance ambient crossovers, the trance scene was, by 93, beginning to move away from some of the heavier hard trance sounds of the previous year with the rise of Goa trance, and with that an interest in psychedelic mind-bending sounds shared with some sides of the ambient house scene. It's at this point that the roots of future styles like Psytrance, Psydub and Psybient can really be found. Notable in this evolution were labels like Australia's Psy Harmonics, which released a couple of albums relevant to this series in 93. Lumakanda's Araglin is one with a blend of trancey synths, tribal beats, dub bass and ambient house style vocal samples. The spellings of and the give away the band's link with the Church of Psychic Youth, and Lumakanda were apparently friends of Psychic Warriors of Gaia, and the two groups share some musical sensibilities. Of the album, Red, Black and Mellow is trance stripped of its pulse. Dance of the Pink Elephants is murky, muggy, tribal down-tempo, overlaid with paranoid synth drones, and Square Root of 529 is a blast of cool air after many of the record's darker sounds. The second half of the album veers more heavily into actual trance, but overall it's an intriguing crossover that shows potential in this new inter-genre experimentation. Ancient Future by Third Eye, which is just about the epitome of psytrance titling, is largely trance but contains a few atmospheric pieces in the form of Sea of Tranquility, Morphic Resonance, Slight Return and the beautiful Chemical Angels. Evening Calm and the two lambent interludes on Zen Paradox's Eternal Brainwave are superb beatless synth ambience, and while only tangentially related, Biomechanical Psychosis is a remarkably forward-thinking IDM track. was fairly customary at this point for trance albums to have one or two beatless or down-tempo tracks, and on the whole it's not really within the scope of this series, although I will mention Australasia, whose psychedelic steep dub trance sounds would be another cornerstone of the future psytrance and psydub styles. Other than the underground scenes in Chicago and Detroit, which birthed house and techno, dance music never really expanded much in the US until the 21st century, except for on a few choice labels. In New York, one such label appeared in 1990, Instinct Records. Starting out with acid jazz, the label quickly adopted dance music when it signed Moby in time for his initial smash hit Go. Instinct was also an early adopter of ambient with its Chill Out compilation and series of releases. Eager to capitalise on Europe's latest musical trends, just about everything electronic was described by the label as either trance or ambient, or both, and each of its releases featured an advert for similar records in the inner sleeve. I don't like this. Either way, there wasn't that much ambient house or ambient techno coming out in the US at the time, so Instinct licensed a few European records. Cabaret Voltaire's Plasticity, the Irresistible Forces Flying High and Underground EP, a compilation of Uwe Schmidt works with the ridiculous title of Pod Communications Presents Atom Heart, The Techno Evolution Continues. Instinct releases from the early 90s are full of daft phrases like this, and prodded Moby for some ambient material. They also managed to find some homegrown ambient techno from Taylor Dupree and Savas Artis, two producers whose careers would dovetail numerous times over the decade. Dupree was already active as part of the acid trio Prototype 909, who had signed to Instinct's techno sub-label Sonic, and he had also begun designing the label's sleeves. Together and separately, Dupree and Artis would release a significant proportion of Instinct's ambient output over the next few years. Artis' main project was Omicron, a word with slightly more sinister connotations in the early 2020s than it had at the time, and his debut EP Symbolis came along in September 93. The front cover states Hard Trance Ambient. Classy. I wouldn't really say there's any hard trance or ambient on this record, although T definitely stands for trance. The remaining 4 tracks are basically techno at different BPMs, the opener Whaler, Strobe Mix being the closest to ambient, with some deep pads and the slowest tempo. It's a pleasant enough track, but nothing on the EP really suggests the more creative works Omicron will put out in the coming years. Released on the same day, Dupree's debut, Hyaline, released as Human Mesh Dance, is a much more promising affair. After a brief intro, the full opening track, Sunflower, is absolutely wonderful, a mix of breaks and drum machines, some rich atmospheric pads and a flute melody. It's laid back but with strong melodic elements and a pulse, the acoustic and electronic mixing to create an excellent halfway point between ambient house and ambient techno. Dupree's first work away from the live acid jamming of Prototype 909, it contains some of the simpler arrangements and repetition that you might imagine, but it's really a remarkably developed project that gives an idea of how creative an artist he is. Counterglow is darker with more of a hint of biosphere in its bleak chords and echoing voices, although the berserk sample of Humanoid, made famous through Stacker Humanoid by FSOL's Brian Dugans, sticks out a bit. Signs of Life and Goodbye feature Prototype 909 members, although interestingly the track sandwiched between them, Moonflower, is the closest to acid house on the record. It might lack a little something, variety perhaps, but for a debut album in a style the artist hadn't worked in before, Hyaline is a really tremendous record, with a very promising start for the American scene. The album hasn't been reissued since, but one of Rediscovery Records' earliest releases is an expanded version of the Hyaline EP, which features 4 of the album's 7 tracks plus 2 compilation works that fit the vibe perfectly, despite being slightly more overtly techno-oriented. As an artist who was most successful during his period of releasing down-tempo records in the late 90s, one might expect an ambient techno album from Moby to be excellent. Sadly it's not, which isn't to say there aren't lovely moments here. Opener My Beautiful Blue Sky is a career highlight, a sweetly melancholic synth piece with gently echoing bongos. Heaven, Tongues, Dog and Myopia are all pleasingly breathy slices of minimal ambient techno. Unfortunately, Jay Brius and Piano and Strings utilised bland synth presets, while some of the second half consists of short pieces in the 1 to 2 minute bracket, all of which leads to a sense of this being a collection of library music pieces rather than a standalone album. On the whole, Ambient is a pleasant enough record, but to me it's always felt a little underwhelming and occasionally sterile, lacking in that most important of aspects, atmosphere. There's some nice stuff, but I just don't listen to this and picture landscapes or feelings. With Plasticity licensed to the label earlier in the year, Instinct managed to release Cabaret Voltaire's next album, International Language, largely in line with its UK Plastex release. After the previous album's rhythmic experimentation, International Language finds the Sheffield duo instead providing a polished techno sound to the beats, although the lengthy tracks mostly feature a decent amount of atmospheric content, often in the form of extended ambient intros. Let It Come Down, meanwhile, is a subterranean dub workout sure to instigate nightmares in anyone who listens to it in the dark. Belly of the Beast switches things up, at least temporarily, as a lovely slice of evocative down-tempo, with loon calls, melancholic synths and hushed spoken samples. The album closes on the sparkling underwater ambience of Otherworld. Kim Cascone's Silent Records is, aesthetically at least, a very different label. There's a very neat parallel with US geography, the cooler, more arty New York on the East Coast hosting Instinct, in contrast with Silence on the West Coast, located from the always hippie-friendly city of San Francisco. Interestingly, the label's origins were very different, with Cascone setting up the imprint initially to release his own PGR project, before going on to publish records by numerous post-industrial acts as well as noise from such luminaries as Merzbow and the Haters. While attempting to distance himself from the more hedonistic end of the industrial scene with a number of more psychedelic and tribal-leaning projects from the likes of Pelican Daughters, the Hafler Trio and Thessalonians, the label's aesthetic was nevertheless very much on the darker and harsher end of experimental music. Cascone was also working in Hollywood, most notably as assistant music director for David Lynch on Wild at Heart and Twin Peaks. As Silent moved out of the cassette underground into a more professional outfit, largely releasing CDs, the style began to shift gradually, with an increase in the industrial adjacent dark ambient style, also tribal ambient from Jeff Greinke and Jorg Reyes. As rave culture hit the US in the early 90s, so the chill-out rooms followed, and with these more overtly ambient records on show in the label's catalogue, Silent began to find itself linked with this new wave of chill-out artists and began to receive demos from ambient acts. Moving into late 93, Cascone started to release a series of records that would make Silent one of the biggest labels in the 90s ambient era. The first album of his own was In a Garden of Eden by his newly christened Heavenly Music Corporation project. Opening with a call of a cockerel, In a Garden of Eden immediately brings to mind the Orb's Little Fluffy Clouds. With this era of Silent arguably being the start of the second wave of 90s ambient, it's easy to consider this an intentional reference. With soft fluffy synths, field recordings of cows and a haunting plucked melody, it's an unassuming intro but one that clearly tells us that this is very much ambient of the 90s chill-out model. The gentle synth drift and field recordings combination forms the first half of the album, with throat singing adding an exotic touch to Ambient to Be Here, a very Orbish title that. Beautiful Dream throws in dolphin sounds, it was only a matter of time, as well as gentle drum machine rhythms and a playful, almost childlike melody. The 15-minute title track features similarly restrained rhythms while bathing in the continual flow of a waterfall, while Closer Re-Entry is built around Didgeridoo played by Steve Roach, and with its 303 bassline veers close to beatless trance in style. According to the liner notes, the music was created for the Space Age Lounge, a techno-mystical chill room in Goa, India. There's no specific mood here, and the album doesn't conjure images of a consistent place, but the atmospheric sounds and field recordings combine to create a collection of tracks that definitely enable a good amount of drifting off into imaginary landscapes. It's an almost unassuming album, maybe the closest the 90s had come to the ignorable music of Eno's first ambient experiments, but all remarkably well put together. It would reappear on Bandcamp with the re-emergence of Silent in 2016 and found its way onto vinyl for the very first time with the 2018 release on Astral Industries. As with that label's earlier release of the later Heavenly Music Corporation album Lunar Phase, tracks are removed to allow the album to fit onto a single slab of wax, which renders the entire affair useless, especially as it removes the stunning The Quiet Mind, probably the album's best track. There's often some awkwardness in the translation of albums designed for CD onto vinyl. When this came out, nobody involved would have predicted vinyl's later resurgence, but outright removing tracks must be the absolute worst way to do it. There wasn't really anything like In a Garden of Eden on Silent before it was released, and it marked an obvious turning point. The label continued to release darker and more industrial records throughout this period, but the emphasis had shifted dramatically towards the new ambient sound. Visually, the album has a pleasingly vague blue and white cover design, somewhat out of keeping with most of Silent's artwork from the period. Put simply, when a lot of people think of 90s ambient record sleeves, what they're thinking of is the art of Silent records, kind of crude computer graphics snuck together in a possibly tasteless way. They're very popular with a certain subset of the fanbase, but the designs, often by Nick Phillip, really don't work for me at all. Later Silent albums like Cluster Zone and Numinous Island would go on to foreshadow the worst excesses of Psydub album art. Every now and then one comes along that has some subtlety or texture to it, but there are some real stinkers in there, the kind of covers I'm almost embarrassed to think about owning. Still, that element of naffness has its charm, and it was definitely a part of the era. Around the same time, Cascone released Deeper Than Space's Earthrise on the silent sub-label Flask, which had been set up to put out more beat-oriented electronica and had debuted earlier in the year with an acid compilation called 1993-03. In the end, Flask only released a handful of records, almost all of them linked to Deeper Than Space's Adam Douglas. With its near unreadable font, spacey cover and digitally altered orca photo in the booklet, Earthrise looks about as 1993 ambient as it's possible to get. There's something about the hippie-ish DIY feel of Silent that makes it stand apart from the other bigger names in 90s ambient, and it's something that provides charm or irritation depending on where you stand. In the credits it states Earthrise was recorded at home, and it sounds like it. There's a review on Discogs that says it sounds like a demo, and that's fair. There are some nice ideas in here, but it's all a bit flat. Really, it's a world away from the exciting sonic depth of most of the music being put out by FSOL, The Orb, Pete Namluke and most of the others at the time. Sunrise is a simple intro, analog synth recorded to tape, while the title track samples The Orb's OOBE and adds 303 bubbles and birdsong. Oracle Orca is 18 minutes of lo-fi synth noodling, while the synth plinks of Deeper Than Love air dangerously close to New Age. So far, so mediocre. The album's saving grace is the 20-minute Spaceship melody, recorded with fellow Flask artist Dreams Without Numbers. A slow dubby beat backs a wonderful acid 303, topped by an exceptionally catchy synth melody. It's repetitive but with enough modulation to never feel tiresome, and occasionally changes into more dramatic tunes are incredibly satisfying. It's reminiscent of Earth by The Orb with the same mix of groovy beats and doomy synths. It's pretty lo-fi, but when you've got a piece as good as this, that really doesn't matter. So good is the track that it was picked out as a very rare single for the label. The Spaceship Melody Remixes single, released as both CD and double 12-inch, runs to nearly 10 minutes longer than the parent album, in the way that only 90s electronica could, and features an even harder to read font on the front cover. Sadly, none of the mixes come close to the quality of the original. Dub in Orbit is little more than the Breaks and 303 line, and the remixes by Dreams Without Number and Heavenly Music Corporation are pretty, but nothing earth-shaking. It's probably a slightly better release than Earthrise, meaning if you want to buy Spaceship Melody, it's your better bet. Weirdly, the single came out 2 years after the album, by which point Deeper Than Space had another couple of albums out and had made a stylistic shift. Amidst the newer ambient artists, Silent continued with the more tribal end of the genre, releasing Solitaire's Ritual Ground. Solitaire was a project by German musician Elmar Schult, who started out in post-Berlin School space music territory at the turn of the decade. By 93, Schult had been joined by former live guest Steve Roach, and the project had morphed into a tribal ambient one, somewhat in line with Roach's own work. As I mentioned in the previous video, the tribal ambient scene is one I find intimidatingly large and confusing, and much of my familiarity is through artists who've released on labels like these, Solitaire among them, as their next album will come out on Recycle or Die. Undoubtedly, this release would have attracted newer ambient listeners who might have not been familiar with the style, and this kind of cross-pollination is one of the joys of ambient at this point. While there was still a relatively small amount of new music around, and much of it difficult to find, listeners had to branch out and find new sounds wherever and however they appeared. Synths drone and sweep, drums gently patter away, and images of vast deserts come and go. It's a lovely little album, and one that hopefully opened up listeners' minds to new sounds. Unsurprisingly, when the album was reissued on Roach's usual home of Project in 2000, the artwork was a dramatic improvement. Remaining releases on Silent that year came in the form of 2 From Here to Tranquility compilations, more on which in a later video, and Polar Regions, an experimental drone work from the Hafler Trio adjacent Cosmic Trigger. Despite its abstract nature, no doubt many ambient heads found it an easy album to get lost in. Released in Japan in May 1993, E.C.C.O is an album of speech by John C. Lilly, neuroscientist, philosopher and one-time friend of Timothy Leary, remixed by Japanese collective PBC, who featured, among their number, Ryoji Akida, experimental musician who would later work with several musicians associated with the ambient techno scene, albeit on more abstract material. By remix, this is basically gentle ambient techno material with a few snippets of Lilly's added in. I'm discussing it here because it was reissued in 1994 on Silent with a couple of Kim Cascone remixes included for good measure. Lilly's content is a big tie-in with the slightly less grounded elements of the hippie counterculture, with liner notes explaining about his belief in the Earth Coincidence Control Office, the echo of the title, an organisation that controls human behaviour and evolution. Track 6, the Cogitate tape loop, is designed to allow the listener to momentarily escape the echo conditioning and witness the reality of how we are programmed by repetition. Or something. There's also stuff that links Lilly's research into human dolphin interspecies communication and how that relates to the dolphin's understanding of echo. It also suggests that autism is a mental illness that can be cured by dolphins, no less, so he can fuck off, really. But some of the music is pretty nice. PBC track The Emerging Love of Man and Dolphin is a heavenly slice of dreamy ambient, thick and lush with synths and samples. The Cascone remixes, as Heavenly Music Corporation and as part of Spice Barons, are similarly lovely synth pieces that twinkle and sparkle. There are also recordings of Lilly and his research if that's the kind of thing you're into. PBC recorded a similar album with Timothy Leary material the following year, but it wasn't reissued by Silent. On a not dissimilar level, former Brit Jonas Sharp released his first album as Spacetime Continuum in '93. Relocated to San Francisco, he'd never actually recorded for Silent, but Alien Dreamtime is similar not only for its location, but also the hookup with modern-day Timothy Leary wannabe Terence McKenna, and its abysmal "Look guys, drugs" style cover by frequent Silent cover artist Nick Phillip. Part of a live performance by Sharp with McKenna spouting his usual stuff over the top, Alien Dreamtime blends ambient techno and spoken word in a slightly unfortunate way. For those who are into McKenna's shamanistic pseudo-spiritual preachings, or at least for those who can stand the sound of his voice, this is no doubt a truly wonderful album. For everyone else, there are just hints of brilliance in the form of the two instrumental tracks, Transient Generator and Aerobatic. Transient Generator, also released as a single, is a really nice slice of ambient techno, gurgling synth sounds and tropical field recordings blended with skeletal beats and wonderful synth melodies. There's always plenty going on throughout the track and it never loses interest. With its faster tempo, slightly soulful chords and 303 line, Aerobatic is pretty much on the techno end of things. The bits I've listened to from the rest of the album sound pretty good, but honestly I can't take more than 2 or 3 minutes of McKenna's voice without my teeth itching. Also, the album definitely opens with a snippet of Dreamtime in Lake Jackson from the KLF's Chill Out, doesn't it? That's it for today's episode of the Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room. I would love to hear your thoughts on the releases I've discussed there. I'm sure there are people who love Terence McKenna and people who love the Silent artwork who want to have a rant at me, telling me how I've completely missed the point. I would love to hear from you as well. And there are like, subscribe and share buttons down below that you also might like to press.